We continue with our theme of loving our neighbor as ourselves in our polarized racial and socio-economic environment. In our podcast this week, we chatted to TED Talk speaker Thobile Chittenden, a community builder, a purpose pioneer with a passionate interest in social and creative entrepreneurship, as well as non-profit organizations. Presently CEO of Makers Valley Partnership, a community organization in the east of Johannesburg CBD, and a director at the Change Collective Africa, which focuses on purpose projects. Also a board member of an inner city school in Johannesburg called City Kids. Hello and welcome to Context. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time here, thank you for taking time out to join us. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing. Hit that little notification bell at the bottom so you won't miss out on Context. Thobile is a driven change agent, passionate about lifting the poor out of the clutches of poverty. She got this drive because her life is one of a white family linking arms with hers to help lift her and her family out of poverty through adoption. Our discussion with Thobile was profound. While the purpose of the interview was primarily to discuss the work that she is doing in Makers Valley of community upliftment under the heading Gaining the Age Without the Age Harming Others, we were caught up in a story of adoption and how this impacted her life and valuable lessons that she has learned. Given that adoption is biblical, requires empathy, and there are thousands of children in our country looking for loving families, we could not miss this opportunity to highlight some of the nuggets Thobile shared. For those of us who are able, this is something that we should be thinking about, whether it is adopting a child or reaching out to help orphans. In fact, during this COVID pandemic, a recent study done by UCT indicates that 1 in every 200 South African children have lost a primary caregiver during the course of the pandemic. Thobile's adoption story started in the early 90s when political violence ripped through KwaZulu-Natal, leaving her family displaced and homeless. Let's take a listen to a snippet of her TED Talk.
My story really begins with the first family that linked their lives to mine. It must have been around the end of 1989 or early 1990 when I was just 8 months old that I could say the first link to the chain of my progression was first formed. My father and mother, both Zulu, were forced to flee their rural home where the frightening political violence in Natal had erupted due to the African-on-African conflict between the ANC and the IFP, which was instigated by the apartheid government at the time. And with nothing but the clothes on their backs and an 8-month-old me, my parents managed to escape the devastation and ended up at the doorstep of a white family, the Richards family, who lived in the suburbs of Lelusha. They did not only open their doors to us, but they changed the trajectory of mine and later my little sister's lives for years to come.
To get the full benefit of our discussion with Thobile, I really encourage you to listen to the full podcast in the link below. It is worth the listen and leads so well into the second part of our discussion next week, where we tackle gaining the edge without the age harming others by ensuring that we flourish without leaving others behind. For now though, let's take a look at the main points and takeaways of the discussion from her experience of adoption. Strikingly, what we learned is that there are costs to the child that need prospective adoptive parents to be intentional in overcoming. Studies show the following latent effects of adoption on children. There's quite a few, but let's discuss 3 prominent ones. 1. Low self-esteem or feeling isolated. Thobile speaks about the complexities of being the only black child when with her white family and friends, whilst on the other hand, being the only black child who could not speak Zulu when in the taxi with her biological mom. She talks about the complexities of code switching, where she had to switch her accent and so on when she was in different cultural settings. Number 2 is lacking belonging. Thobile narrates the complexity of trying to please 2 sets of parents with different value systems. Her biological mom, for example, valued and expected introversion, while her adoptive mom valued extroversion. Being raised by a family who could not speak English meant her Zulu deteriorated, and so she became embarrassed at her poor pronunciation of the language, which meant she avoided the embarrassment by not speaking, period. And as a consequence, lost it altogether. This had the painful consequence of ostracizing her from her black heritage. Even her English presented its fair share of problems in that she struggled to code switch when amongst black people due to a white Bryanston accent, to the point that even going to the shops was a cultural struggle. People instinctively spoke to her in a language she didn't even understand simply because she was black. Number 3, identity problems and lacking positive role models that can show the way of being black in a white world. There's an impulse in the adoption conversation to paint the adoptive parent as a savior, propelled by humanitarian instinct, who swoops in and saves the child. Unfortunately, for this identity to stick, there needs to be someone in need of rescuing. That's a lousy burden for a child. This creates the burden of an unpayable debt. For the adoptee, the imposition of forced gratitude is emotionally crippling. That is according to Korean adoptee Mark Hegland, a 54-year-old journalist and adoption literary advocate. He further says parents who believe they can raise their children colorblind are making a terrible mistake. He goes on to say it's shocking how many people he meets who still think this way. He says if there's a single thing I can share with white adoptive parents, it's to look at the adult adoptees who have committed suicide or who have substance abuse problems. Love was not enough for them. Thobile mentions that when her black friends came over for sleepovers, they would be perplexed at her lifestyle, and she struggled with her friendships at school. Who am I? Who and how do I relate? How does she engage in different racial circles? Despite the love of her adoptive parents, South African society still painfully racially pigeonholed her. Again, I encourage you to go and listen to the podcast. Schedule some time in during the week on your school run or on the way to the office, or perhaps while you are relaxing on Sunday afternoon. You will not be disappointed. Despite the challenges of transracial adoption, it is still by far a good and godly thing. Its most obvious benefits are: firstly, it is a biblical principle. The Bible uses adoption as a compelling metaphor to illustrate God's covenant love for his people and his desire to see us as part of his family. Adoptive families can experience a small piece of that in the permanence of the family God forms in their midst. Secondly, the child is guaranteed a better education and standard of living. Birth parents can know that they set an enduring plan into motion for their child, just as God sacrificially through Christ put our salvation in place. The miracle of that transfer and grafting of that transfer and the child into his new permanent family, so carefully planned and desired by both families, is a beautiful image of our permanent place in God's family. Given the above, how do we make it better for the child being adopted? We should ask ourselves, why do we want to adopt? Our motives must be right before God. We must be aware that it is more than providing food and clothing, but also emotional and sociological well-being. Number 3, considering open adoption is first prize, where a relationship with both sets of parents is supported and encouraged. We must reject the false dichotomy that children are either yours or mine. Studies affirm this approach. In light of our racially divided history as South Africans, adoption is such a beautiful opportunity for different families of diverse backgrounds to come together and etch out a way or a future for an adopted child that will allow them the powerful ability to move confidently and seamlessly, feeling like they belong in a diverse sociological world such as that of South Africa. This is a love and working together that extends beyond the boundaries of choosing between black and white. That's it for this week. Until next time, salani kahle. Cheers, bye-bye.